What it do, TOK 2 students? This is your old pal, Mr. Carley, coming back with you again because it's that time of year. I didn't do it last year specifically. I guess I kind of had a little one, but this is the big one right here. So we're gonna look at a TOK essay plan for question number 3. What I do, if you're someone that doesn't go to Renaissance High School in the Boise metropolitan area of Idaho, probably shouldn't give away that much information about myself. Anyway, if you just what I do is I let the students vote during the semester on which one they would like me to do, and thank God there was a coup d'etat attempted where they were going to try to get me to answer that ugly number 2 question, but luckily this one won, so we're doing number 3. If you have any questions about any other ones specifically, I can field those, but this is the only one I'm going to do for the whole shebang. Okay. Also, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Smash that like button. Let's keep those likes higher, those dislikes. Yeah, so on and so forth. Okay, cool. Moving on. So I picked. Wow, nice animations, Mr. Carley. Thanks, Mr. Carley. No, I didn't pick it. You picked it. We voted on question 3. So question 3, or a title 3, is Nothing could possibly be more exciting than fresh ideas. So why are areas of knowledge often so slow to adopt them? Discuss with reference to human sciences and one other area of knowledge. So there you go, my friends. One question I always ask myself is, why do they pick the one that they pick for that question? But what a student who shall remain nameless alerted me is that each area of knowledge is specifically called out one time throughout the 6 prompts. So I don't know if there was actually a reason they picked human sciences. I think there might have been a reason they picked human sciences, but anyway, we'll take a look at that. So here's what we got. First off, really, how about I tell you about all the things that are more exciting than fresh ideas, because I have a lot of ideas for things that are more exciting than fresh ideas, but we don't want to challenge the prompt in that way. So breaking down the prompt, I can barely see this. My God, the way that PowerPoint has you record now, I can't even see what I'm looking at. So anyway, breaking down the prompt. So in the introduction, what I like to do and advise students to do is break down the prompt to set up how you're going to answer it. Despite what IB might tell you and what the TOK fanatics might tell you, theory of knowledge is at its essence, this is a philosophy essay. Okay, so what you want to do is break down the question and talk about how you're going to answer it within the parameters, the problem space, as it were. So, fresh ideas. What I'm thinking here is that this is something that is new, or at least within the context of that area of knowledge is new, maybe a way they didn't think about it anymore. So for example, I'm going to talk about behavioral economics later, which is a way of integrating specific psychology concepts into economics that would be new for that area of knowledge, or that discipline within that area of knowledge, related to the knowledge framework. So I'm going to always try to bring it back. The TOK essay is about areas of knowledge, so we're going to try to bring it back to the knowledge framework of areas of knowledge, which is outlined by the IB as being the scope, or what is known or can be known, or what can't be known within the area of knowledge, methods and tools of gaining knowledge, the different perspectives within that discipline or that field of study, and then how ethics could or could not play, or may not play a role. So something about that. That's how I'm defining fresh ideas. So I don't think there's a dictionary definition for fresh ideas, but somebody could tell me if there is. And then accepted. What does it mean for an idea to be accepted? So here, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go look at how knowledge is shared within an epistemic community. So epistemic community, if you're not familiar, are communities of knowers. So groups of people that know some type of common knowledge. And I'm going to put particular emphasis on how it is shared between academic or specialized communities and the public or the generalized community. And that's going to come into play, especially when I do my second area of knowledge, which I'll get to in a second. But basically what I'm going to look at is how is it accepted within the discipline, and then also how it relates to being portrayed to the broader public as this is what this field of study believes or knows or thinks is a predominant perspective. That's how I'm going to decide if it's accepted or not, because I feel like there's a lot of different ways you could decide if something's accepted or consider something accepted. Okay, my framework. So what I typically do, this is an old debate term, at least for public forum as far as I know, which is what is your framework? So how are you seeing the question? What are the parameters? How are you going to discuss it? So This, I know I need to be careful because, like all good theory of knowledge essays, this has to be about knowledge. But the prompt asks about ideas, which is a little bit different. So I'm going to focus on the TOK knowledge framework. So see above, like I'm going to say an idea has to be related to knowledge by doing something related to the knowledge framework within that area of knowledge. Otherwise, I'm just talking about random ideas or concepts, and I got to make sure I'm not doing that. So, yeah. I'm going to use human social sciences as an area of knowledge because that's required by the title. I'm going to use history because I always think that it would behoove you to go with what you know or what interests you. I am a social studies teacher. Rest in peace, IB history at Renaissance High School. But I used to teach IB history, and I teach history. I teach a lot of stuff. Anyway, so I'm going to focus on history because that's kind of what I know, and I think there's a lot of good examples that you could use. And then I'm going to discuss mostly how methods and tools of gaining knowledge and perspectives on knowledge are accepted or not accepted. I'm moving. Oh, I thought I could move myself. Yeah. So anyway, I'm focusing on methods and perspectives. Here's my working thesis or set of claims that I'm going to go from. Again, I don't think your thesis has to be the same throughout. I think part of this is a period of exploration, finding yourself in terms of what you believe is true. Believe, what do you know? Related to knowledge. So why did I go backwards? Okay, so so fresh ideas are, my first thing that I'm going to say is fresh ideas are not uniformly rejected or accepted. That's me challenging the prompt. They're saying, why are they always so slow to be accepted? They're not always slow to be accepted. I think it's kind of inherent, if you've taken TOK for any amount of time, that you can't just accept what it's saying absolutely. So they're not uniformly rejected or accepted by any area of knowledge in terms of like their rapidity, okay? Instead, the specific aspect of the knowledge within the knowledge framework impacts how quickly new ideas are accepted. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. So knowledge in the social sciences, what I'm going to argue is that they're often slow to be accepted because there's often disagreement regarding the appropriate methodology for creating knowledge, especially since human sciences or social sciences is such a broad area of knowledge that encompasses a lot of subdisciplines, and even within those subdisciplines, there's not really a great uniform, agreed upon way in which you're supposed to create the knowledge or the knowledge is created, which is exactly so. Why did I say it like that? God. Okay. History, fresh ideas, I'm going to say, are more quickly accepted because methodologies are more widely agreed upon. However, perspectives can slow the process of acceptance, especially when it comes to sharing this knowledge with broader communities. So I'll talk about how maybe when the methodology is set up well and there's agreement on what methodologies are of gaining knowledge, then maybe the ideas are more accepted quickly, and then maybe it's more of a matter of perspective. And that's kind of where I started. And then I actually showed, I like to think, some intellectual growth as we went on because I decided not to set this essay up the way that I initially thought I was going to. So yeah, take that, get ready. So I like to break this up like you would a philosophy paper into two discussions. The discussions you can set up however you'd like. An easy way to do it is to have a discussion about one area of knowledge and then a discussion about a second area of knowledge, and at the end doing some comparing, contrasting, because generally what they want is for you to do some comparison, some contrast of the different areas of knowledge that you choose. But if you want to go into that 7, 8, 9, 10 realm, I would highly, highly, highly suggest that you don't do it like that, and you think about what is a more nuanced way that I can think about this question. And for me, the way that I thought about it was I'm going to do a discussion about how acceptance of new or fresh ideas, what did I say? Oh, I'm going to do one discussion about how there was acceptance of new or fresh ideas when the knowledge relates to the methods and tools of gaining knowledge. So I'm going to say when the new idea or the new concept is directly related to a new or maybe ambiguous method of gaining knowledge, that's going to affect how quickly it is adopted. And then I'll talk about my second one later, but that's what I'm going to do. If you watched the previous slide, you probably know where I'm going to go with this. So in this section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at both slow and quick acceptance of knowledge and new ideas. Another way you can set it up is have a discussion about slow acceptance and a discussion about fast acceptance, and that's cool too. That's a nuanced way of doing it. But I think for me, it worked out better if I did it this way. So anyway, I'm going to look at both slow and quick acceptance of knowledge or new ideas, but I'm going to focus my discussion on the impact of the new ideas related to methods and tools of gaining knowledge, so the methodology specifically. Okay, so my first example, I'm going to be real with you, I have not decided which one of these I would look at, but I would probably just choose one and discuss it in more detail. You can sprinkle in, pepper in, like little ideas from like other places, or little references to other things, but I don't want to have like really surface level analysis, so I'm going to pick probably one of these to do. So anyway, here's some ideas I had. I focused a lot on psychology, but you could do a lot of different ones. Freudian psychology, psychoanalysis, that was slow to be accepted. And now I would even argue that after it gained widespread acceptance during the heyday of psychodynamics, psychoanalytics. Anyway, I would say that actually it's kind of been rejected now. And I think a lot of mainstream psychology rejects it because there's been this shift towards more empirical, naturally scientific psychology. But anyway, positive psychology as a subdiscipline of psychology, intersectionality, which is not necessarily psychology, it's a kind of a sociological concept, but you could apply it to psychology. You could use like Margaret Mead cultural anthropology if you want to use anthropology. So different things that were kind of, these are all things that were kind of slow to be accepted in human sciences. So I'm going to choose one of them and talk about it in detail. And my second example is going to be a contrast of something that was kind of more widely accepted. So I'm going to talk about like the development of historical methodology over time and how that led to a breakdown of historical focal points, as I'm going to call them, or they're not really schools of thought, they're more like sub-disciplines. So looking at primary and secondary sources or the analysis of history and how that's done by historians, and then how that led to widely accepted historical breakdowns of historical focal points. So now you have these like specializations within history where people focus on political history or economic history or military history or social history, and things of that nature, or people just focus on time periods. So anyway, so how like that's widely accepted as a way of doing history because the methodology of creating knowledge in history is so widely accepted already and agreed upon. Okay, so those are my examples. I'm going to contrast those. What I'm probably going to talk about, if I were to write this whole thing out, is I would talk about how in psychology and in the social sciences specifically, the methodology and what is an appropriate methodology is not always widely agreed upon. There's 4 big methods of creating knowledge in social sciences. Typically, there are surveys, there's correlational studies, there's observations or case studies. I kind of lump those together, and there's experimentation. And those are kind of the 4 ways. You can break them down in different ways. Your teacher might have done it differently, depending on what you had, but that's kind of what you do. And I think there's not an agreed upon way of like saying this is the scientific, that social sciences tries to incorporate the scientific method, but it's very inductive. It's very dependent on how the research is set up. It's very dependent on operational definitions. All those things are inherent to psychology, anthropology, political science to an extent. So I think that that's a reason why when you have a new idea, because there's not a lot of wide agreement about how that knowledge was produced or should have been produced, I think that leads to the slow acceptance. And then eventually maybe even more rejection over time. So like now the methodology of Freudian psychology is called into question because there's a lot more focus in psychology now on the scientific method, experiments, biological psychology, for example. So that's kind of how I would do that. Whereas history, it's kind of been, as long, there's not a lot of disagreement about how to create knowledge in history. It's just about like how you interpret it. And I'm going to get to that later. But you're looking at primary and secondary sources. You're studying change in continuity. You're studying multiple causality. That's all like things that historians widely agree upon, which is why when you have these new ideas or these new focal points is what I'm going to focus on in history of like the development of political history, the development of economic history, so on and so forth. Generally, it's pretty accepted pretty quickly. So I'll probably just pick one of those and kind of talk about the background, the history, and why it was accepted, and talk about the methodology of history. So my implications, connections, I kind of already described this, but since human sciences is so broad in its discipline, there's not a universal agreement on appropriate methods and tools for gaining knowledge. Even within the discipline, even within like psychology, there's not a lot of agreement about how to gain the knowledge most appropriately in every single case. History, on the other hand, is a generally agreed upon set of methodology, conceptual understandings, and I'll probably go back to IB history because I know IB people like you to bring in IB related concepts. So I might talk about like the 6 big concepts of history, change continuity, causation, which they say cause and effect, significance, perspective. I think I only said 4 because I tie some of them together. But anyway, which leads to wider acceptance of new ideas, provided the methodologies are sound. So that's kind of that's my big takeaway that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to throw in some various TOK concepts because I want to sound like I took a TOK class, right? That's the whole point of this. So I might bring in things like inductive reasoning, rationalism, empiricism, paradigm shifts, the scientific method, how we communicate through language and the importance of that, maybe, if it applies. Also, how various ideas of empiricism apply to different areas of knowledge. The fact that we can't go back into the past, so we have to have an agreed upon methodology of how we understand the past if anybody's going to agree that things actually happen the way that we think they did. So things of that nature. So all of that's going to be in here in my first discussion. My goal is not to write the entire essay right now. I just want to show you this is what I would kind of talk about. These are some of the examples I would pull apart, how I would look at them. So talk about example 1, talk about example 2. Always want to make sure we have some type of connection or comparison to the big idea that we're bringing away. All right, on to discussion 2. So discussion 2, I'm going to talk about how the acceptance of new ideas can be slow or quick, depending on the implications of perspective. So I focused on more methodologies and tools. First discussion, now I'm going to focus on perspective. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to show some issues related to how new ideas are accepted when the issue at hand is more about perspective as opposed to method. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I was thinking for this one. So example 1 is in the human sciences, and this time I'm going to talk a little bit about economics because I also taught economics back in the day, so I have a little bit of knowledge about this, but economics has some really great examples. For example, game theory, behavioral economics, human capital theory, and I started to think, why is this? Why are things that seem like they're so quickly accepted, accepted in economics as opposed to something like psychology or anthropology or sociology? What makes economics different? So what I kind of came away with is, well, econ is generally accepted line of methodology that's based on common assumptions that are demonstrated using modeling. That's what economics is all about. There are very common assumptions within economics about how human beings act with their resources, and it's much more deductive reasoning, like this leads to this leads to this, as opposed to more inductive, like a lot of the other human sciences. You could say it's kind of the most mathy of the human sciences. And they have these agreed upon models of how the world would work if it worked based off those assumptions, which it never works based off those assumptions in the real world, which is a good example of something I'm going to talk about in a second. Nope, that's not what I talked about. There could be a wider acceptance of varying perspectives since a model does not equal reality. So as long as you're using the model and you're using the model appropriately, maybe, and I'm making a little bit of a logical leap here of an implication, but maybe that's why it's okay to have varying perspectives and different schools of thought that are accepted. And economists generally, they have very, very gentlemanly-esque, very friendly disagreements with one another when you hear them debate things on radio shows and stuff. And that might be why. So the model doesn't equal reality. So really what's happening here, this gets back to the 3 truth tests that we talked about, at least in our TOK class. So this is like pragmatic truth in economics. A lot of theories in economics are accepted because they have practical, useful impacts. So as long as it's useful as opposed to correspondingly true, it seems like a lot of things in economics are like behavioral economics or game theory, things like that, because they have a use, they're usually accepted as true, and the perspective doesn't matter as much. Or I'm not saying the perspective doesn't matter as much, but the difference in perspective maybe doesn't matter as much, and that's because there seems to be an agreed upon methodology and a focus on pragmatic truth in economics. Maybe economists would disagree with me on this, but that's kind of what I'm seeing, at least with these examples. And then I might actually also include, what we want to show is that we're thinking widely here, that we can evaluate perspectives. So I might say, yeah, but is this actually acceptance? Is that what's happening here? Are they accepting, or are they more just kind of showing apathy toward their disagreement because maybe they feel like there isn't a real corresponding answer? And it may not matter unless these ideas are shared. So maybe we might kind of have to focus on how is our economic ideas being shared. I can tell you that if you're somebody that's 53 years old like myself, maybe you read popular economics books for funsies, okay? And maybe that matters how the popular the popular public. The popular audience maybe interprets these things, but maybe that's the only time. Maybe in the academia, maybe in the specialized discourse, maybe it doesn't matter as much if the disagreement, if it's not real acceptance, if it's just kind of like you do you. You know what I mean? So I might talk about, I might not say you do you, but I might talk about that a little bit. Example 2 is going to be about shared historical knowledge. So what perspectives are allowed to dominate? And I might give some specific example. As a history teacher, I know a lot about, especially in the state of Florida, what's going on with how AP US history is taught. There's AP African American Studies, which is kind of like an African American history class. I might go back to the historical example of in the 1990s. There was a focus on creating national history standards, and those were flatly rejected by Congress. And then maybe think about, is Congress the same as historians? What does that mean for us if we're saying that we're going to accept historical knowledge if our elected bodies are the ones that tell us what the historical knowledge base should be? There's a lot of implications there. I might stray too far from the question at that point. That might be a good custodians of knowledge question, but anyway. Maybe I talk about, there's been a lot of talk about critical race theory as a historical perspective and whether or not that's appropriate to be considered historical perspective. There's a lot of different examples of that, 1619 Project, things of that nature. So I might talk about like debates about that. I got to be careful because this is supposed to be about being accepted within an area of knowledge, not necessarily by a political body. So it's treading a fine line there. You got to make sure you're not straying off too much. So I might also show some nuance in my thinking, and I say, yeah, but aren't these disagreements also about methodology? Like perhaps they're just saying this isn't real history. You're not doing history appropriately. And I say, yeah, perhaps, but often the disagreement comes when the interpretation part of the methodology, and there's a fine line between interpretation and perspective. A lot of times your perspective is related not so much to the methods you used and the sources you looked at, but to your interpretation, your perspective on things, which might lead to a bias. So there's a number of TOK concepts I can talk about there: interpretation, power, truth, inductive reasoning, a lot of different things there. So my general connection or implication here is that perspective flows from having an agreed upon methodology. It's hard to have accepted varying perspectives if you don't have an agreed upon methodology, because otherwise you're going to say that perspective is wrong because it used the wrong methodology. But if the methodologies are all sound and kind of uniformly agreed upon, it might be easier to have a faster acceptance of new perspectives and a slower acceptance of other ones. So anyhow, sometimes new ideas are accepted because their methodologies allow room for varying perspectives or because they are useful. Other times perspectives are challenged when they challenge the accepted narratives or have some type of emotional implication for the general epistemic community. So that goes back to that idea of sharing. Like a lot of these examples we're talking about how history relates to education, which is some, like Ms. Bryant, would argue is human sciences, but I disagree. I think that's actually more of how the area of knowledge is being shared with the public as opposed to the specialized community. So that's a theme that I kind of weave in throughout this essay. So here are some things just in the conclusion. Okay, I personally think like a conclusion that just summarizes your main points is a little bit overrated. So what I would focus more on are the key takeaways, implications, maybe some things on the rubric that I didn't get to yet, re-clarifying my thesis a little. So I did address some implications somewhat in the body, but I would like to maybe find one or two more things to really hammer it home. So the biggest takeaway I would say is that there's more of a continuum of acceptance as opposed to just like quick acceptance, slow acceptance, no acceptance. So which actually kind of is a continuum if you think about it. But I would say that like it really depends on a lot of factors, which is pretty much what they're looking for you to say, right? But the biggest takeaway though is that it's not specific to any one discipline. All right, it's more about the consistency or uniformity of the area of knowledge. So within that area of knowledge, what are the common methods? What are the common perspectives? You could even talk about scope or ethics, but I tried to focus on just a couple things because I only got 1,600 words here. Okay. Another major takeaway that I was thinking about was the extent to which new knowledge based on these new ideas or concepts is meant to be shared across a broad epistemic community is key to how quickly they're accepted or dismissed. So when things are going to be shared broadly, especially with the generalized public, and by generalized, we usually think about like kids, the popular people, the population of a community, that's going to have a big impact on whether or not things are accepted. And I talked about that with my econ example, my history examples as well. However, I might challenge the prompt here since I got some word space, right? This prompt is inherently limiting because of the fact that judging the rapidity of acceptance is a subjective interpretation. Like, the whole thing is subjective. How do I know how fast something has been accepted? How do I know that my definition of quickly accepted is different? Like, we can't really do this in like time or years. I think what we're actually looking at is the debate and how intense the debate was over whether or not this idea was accepted. But then how do we gauge intensity? So I wouldn't go on a long ramble about this, but I would maybe say that it's kind of difficult to directly pinpoint how fast something is accepted. All we can really do is focus on what are the main points of disagreement and how do they relate back to the inherent flaws or shortcomings or lack of uniformity within the methods and the perspectives of that area of knowledge. So that's how I would try to tackle this, trying to keep it under 30 minutes. Would I get my goal is always, I don't know if going for a 10 out of 10 on your TOK essay is really what you want to do at this point. What I'm just trying to do is hit the main things on the rubric and make sure I've accounted for them and try to take a little more nuanced approach where I'm not just saying this is one way of thinking about it, this is another way. I'm trying to kind of weave in some different ideas. So hopefully you find this helpful. Yeah, otherwise, maybe I'll see you in another 6 months or so, year, who knows? But always appreciate comments, always appreciated. Hopefully it's helpful, and talk to you later. Peace.